Getting closer. Oh, they're very good.
It's my honor. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Well, we'll see. Thank you. Hey, Howard. Good to see you. Doctor, how are you? Pleasure to meet you.
I'm Brenda Evans.
Hey, Brenda, how's it going? 2 months in ICU, 7 months in hospital. You think I'm joking? No, you're incredible. That was a nurse thing. Yeah. You're sick, we did not. I'll have to tell what I said out loud, so you don't think it's a secret. I said, if there are any angels in heaven, they're all nurses. So, Nick, we got something in common, pal. Sorry. But you're making, you both have to make something of it.
We almost wrote together.
Hey, Stephanie, really? Yes, how are you? Good to see you.
Good night.
Good to see you, Jim. Thank you, God. Appreciate it.
I noticed that you don't have a name card, so I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce to the Duke community Mr. Vice President Joe Biden. If you'd like to make a few comments, sir, we'd be appreciative.
Well, I would. In Washington, I am referred to as Jill Biden's husband, and I usually blame the president when I'm late, but unfortunately, he's not in Washington. I can't blame him, but I apologize for keeping you all waiting. And I want to thank you, Doctor. I want to thank Duke as well as the University of North Carolina for providing this opportunity. Look, almost, and I suspect this goes for the audience as well and members of the press, almost everyone in the world has a family member who has had a brush with or a loss as a consequence of cancer. And every year, over 14 million people are diagnosed with cancer, and 8 million succumb to it. Like many of you, particularly my new friend Nicholas, we've experienced that dreaded word that you get, and the diagnosis, some more dire than others. And when I decided not to seek the nomination in October, and I walked out in the Rose Garden with the president to make the announcement, it was genuine but almost spontaneous when I said the one regret was that I think that we have, as a consequence of an inflection point we've reached in this area, an opportunity to fundamentally change the trajectory of not just the treatment of cancer, but the ability to do in the next 5 years, if we work at it well, what would take 10 to 15 years. And I said that I believe that we need an absolute national commitment to end cancer as we know it. I'm not naive. I didn't think we could, quote, end cancer. I'm not looking for a silver bullet. There is none. I have to admit, though, that I was absolutely dumbfounded, Doctor, by the international response I received. I've been doing this a long time. I've had some significant responsibility in my role as chairman of the Judiciary and as well as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and the responsibilities the president has assigned me. But I was absolutely stunned by the instantaneous, and I mean this literally, worldwide response that I got. I heard from thousands of survivors and hundreds of experts, like many of you around the table who are leading this fight. I've met so far with over 220 oncologists researchers and folks in your fields. And I've subsequently met with dozens of philanthropists who've invested literally billions of dollars thus far, and 3 new philanthropists each worth well over $1 billion who want to get involved and do more. But what I learned was that money is necessary and critical, but it's not the answer to do what we have to do. My staff has met with dozens of other organizations and philanthropies, and again, I'm not naive that we're going to find a cure to every cancer. But we're talking about prevention and early detection. We've learned from all of you that the possibility of developing vaccines to prevent cancer, like HPV for cervical cancer, and the promise is immense in other areas. And there are enormous breakthroughs that I'm preaching to the choir. Everyone around this table surely knows this and knows much more than I do. But we've learned that there's not just one cancer, there are thousands of cancers. And my guess is, from speaking to many of you, including 4 Nobel laureates in the field, that in 5 years we're not going to be talking about colon or breast or brain cancer. I mean, we're talking about the cancer can locate anywhere, and it may be made up of, and there are thousands of cancers. There's enormous progress, and the science, I think, is ready. I've learned from personal experience, and with the help of a number of brilliant scientists and doctors, there are multiple disciplines that are needed to attack this disease. I was asked to keynote the Davos conference in Switzerland a couple weeks ago. And the keynote they asked me to speak to, which was beyond my capacity, but I'm not sure it's within anybody's, is the 4th Industrial Revolution and what it means to society worldwide. And in the process, it was interesting. The founder of Davos and a group came to me and said, would I chair a roundtable on cancer? That was not part of what I had agreed to do at all. And as a consequence, there were some very important people in your fields representing other universities, as well as everyone from the Cleveland Clinic to the Mayo Clinic to others. But the interesting thing was that there were a number of there were engineers, biochemical engineers. And what I knew about, there was impressed the audience. It was about twice the size of this audience at the time, and they were made up of the leading CEOs in the world. The major, over 2,400 show up at this conference, which has been going on for a while, and heads of state. And the one thing I'm relatively schooled in is, after all these years, is reading an audience. And so I finished speaking, and we're just like this lineup. And it started off with the first speaker. And I began to watch people who were sitting like this in their chairs. And by the time we got to the last speaker, people were up in their chairs like this. And what blew them away was the multiple disciplines that are needed to make the kind of progress we're on the verge of being able to make. As I said, I'm not naive that we're going to cure every cancer, but I've learned from personal experience and that there are multiple disciplines: immunologists, geneticists, virologists, molecular biologists, chemical engineers, bioengineers, technology companies adept in supercomputing and aggregating data, and practicing oncologists who deliver on the front lines every day without access to nearly the amount of information that's already available. I met with some of the world's top cancer fighters, and visited a number of major cancer institutions. That this great university and medical school, the University of Pennsylvania, has quite an operation. So does So does MD Anderson, and I met with 200 doctors in a new operation called GBM Agile, an international consortia that is utilizing adaptive clinical trials where they're able to make changes in clinical trials while the trials are underway, resulting in potentially more, faster advances as well as improved patient outcomes. Also, we soon be going to UC San Francisco, some of the great, at least one of the 3 or 4 great surgeons in the world, as well as others, the Cleveland Clinic, Dana-Farber, Sloan Kettering. There seems to be a consensus from folks of your caliber, top cancer fighters around a number of issues. And the first, and this is what I want you to talk with me about, if you will, and whether because I may be wrong. One area of consensus is that we really are at an inflection point. I was stunned to learn how much has changed just in the last 5 years. And again, as Nicholas can say, you tend to learn a lot when you are fighting for the life of someone you care about. Or my mother would say, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. But until the last few years, I was unaware that the major thrust of cancer treatment for the previous 40 years or more was get as much of the tumor out as you can, overwhelm it as quickly as you can with as much radiation targeted as you can, and then lay on and pour on the as much as you can targeted chemotherapy. A lot of you were telling me that that all those 3 disciplines are needed, but that there's a growing sentiment that it may be killing the natural immune system when we do that. I mean, I thought that was known for some time. No, I'm not. No. I'm not being facetious because, it's members of my family with cancer, my mother, others, my son, and then so that we've now moved beyond that point. You've moved beyond that point. Today, you're delivering personalized and tailored treatments. I met a beautiful young woman who you have changed and saved her life with amazing new treatment. And you're delivering, as I said, personalized, tailored treatment based on genomics of individual tumors. In the past few years, I've seen some amazing advances in technology and immunotherapy, genomics, virology, combination therapies, right here at Duke. Doc, I know you know, but I just want you to, I know and the rest of the country knows, you have an incredible operation. You guys are on the cusp of such great advances. Dr. Modric, who, by the way, is I hang around with a lot of Nobel laureates. Actually, I've gotten to know more Nobel laureates than you can imagine. It's one of the great advantages of this job as vice president. They hang out with you. Has done groundbreaking work in mismatching repair, which repairs errors that are occurring during DNA replication and can lead to cancer. As the doctor pointed out, we need more money in pure science, by the way, Mr. Vice President. I think he's right. Dr. Gromeyer, who has been a pioneer in immunotherapy, he has genetically modified the poliovirus to target and kill cancers, and as was the case with that beautiful young woman out there who looks as healthy as can be. Doctor, you chair a neurosurgical department that is recognized as a leader in experimental complex brain tumors, and you're investigating brain tumor infusion and immunotherapy with a practical focus on a particular cancer I have a great interest in, glioblastoma. So I think I could go on and on about this for the audience and the press, but in my view, and I became an attorney because I wasn't smart enough to become a scientist, but all kidding aside, the science is ready. The science is ready, it seems to me. Much more has to be done. But I believe we can make much faster progress as an outsider looking in from a different perspective, if we see greater collaboration, greater sharing of information. In short, breaking down some of the research that is trapped inside of silos and share information with drug companies, and drug companies be willing to be more forthcoming in sharing information. I will not go into it, but there's not an oncologist here who doesn't understand that now that you are working with across disciplines of immunotherapy and genomics and the rest, that one drug company may have a particular drug that works well, and another drug company a different drug, and the overwhelming inclination of all of you is if you combine the two, it may be better, but getting that done is like getting a nuclear deal with Iran. Only we've been more successful. But it's, again, the science is ready, and we have to figure out a way to share information more. And for a moment, I'd like to focus, Doctor, on big data. I think as an outsider looking in, trying to become as informed as I possibly can, the greatest hope lies in the aggregating of enormous amounts of data that exist out there already. And a few years ago, it took more than a decade and $3 billion to sequence the human genome. The head of NIH was one of the leaders in that effort. And it now takes less than a day and costs about $1,500. But it's spread all over the world. A piece of data is here at Duke, another at MD Anderson, pieces are at other institutions. Imagine if we could co-locate that information. Or as I said to your resident Nobel laureate, imagine if we had total access in one form of the Utah population data. Imagine what can happen. But it's spread all over the world. And I met, as I said, in Davos, and I met with four incredibly competent, advanced groups that have put themselves together, leading cancer institutions, SAPs involved, others, Oracle. And I listened to them, and they're all doing the same thing. They're all about to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, in aggregate well over $1 billion, for them to have their own data collection. And I asked them, I'll tell you all this, I asked them all whether or not, and they're going to meet with me a week Friday, whether they'd be willing to meet with me alone in a room in the vice president's residence to answer the question, why? No, I'm not being facetious. I'm being deadly earnest about this. I understand the way the system is built, and there's nothing wrong with it. The profit motive is there. I joked, do you remember a senator named Lawton Childs from Florida? Great guy. I got there when I was 29 years old, and he had just been elected in Florida, walking Lawton. He walked the length of the state of Florida, and really smart guy. And we're getting off during the period of Watergate. We're getting off that subway you ride from the office building over to the Capitol and going up the escalator, and a group of national reporters will understand this, at the top of the escalator. And he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said, Joe, why do I feel like they're looking at me as if I'm a Pulitzer Prize about to be won? Well, I think an awful lot of you, with good reason, are looking at maybe I'm a Nobel laureate about to be named. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But we got to figure out modalities to help break down some of these silos. And maybe the only thing I'll be able to do with any dispatch is be a convener and maybe help negotiate some of the transitions that have to take place. But big data takes more than promise because of the incredible advances in takes on more promise because of the incredible advances in computing capabilities. And just in the last few years, of course, when we talk about patients' data, we also have to take into account, which we haven't solved yet completely, which I think is within our reach, the privacy concerns. And also, who owns the data? Does the patient own the data? I'm working with the Department of Energy and our national laboratories, which is probably the best kept and one of the most vital assets the United States of America possesses. And I met with Secretary Ernie Moniz, a brilliant scientist in his own right. And he heads the Department of Energy and the national labs. And we've initiated a project called National Strategic Computing Initiative with the goal of making supercomputers capable of 1 billion calculations per second. 1 billion calculations per second. And our scientists in the labs think it's within reach. It's within reach. They're working on a project that is with enormous focus, but the promise, if that occurs, is equally as enormous. We can get data, if we can get data in one place, the bottom line is that, we need all hands on deck. Big data captures the big picture. Let me give you all, I know the docs know this, but the press, one example. A few weeks ago, I convened, as I said, some of the leading folks in the world. And one of the docs who at Davos in Switzerland testified, he told me that a paper came out last year showing that if you had ovarian cancer and were taking a particular blood pressure medication, you live significantly longer. The way that was found is comparing outcomes. Why is it that one treatment works, and the same exact treatment doesn't work on the patient diagnosed with the similar, if not the same, malady? He said that something that never would have happened, that would have been picked up by biology alone or researchers working in silos, but it did get picked up because of data and computing advances and their capacity to look across wide patient populations. We can use that data to understand a person's cancer, to uncover similarities in responses across large patient groups, to help design the best course of therapy. And these are the brightest minds in the world sitting in this room that have the capacity to do that. But we have to break down those silos and share the data. Dr. David Argus of USC was one of the people on the panel, and he sat where you are, Doc, and we've known one another for a little while. He said that there's a big problem out there, and it was interesting watching the reaction of his colleagues. He said, we don't have a set of standards how to collect data and how to label data, how we process data, or even how the data is, as I said, labeled. And he gave some examples. Not to oversimplify, but in some cases, I may call it a broken leg. In another case, it may be listed as a fractured leg. That is not automatically picked up by the computer as it's associating all the similar problems. He called for the establishment of a national standard for including an international standard, which makes it even harder. So that the most powerful computers can aggregate, search, and process data. So it seems to me one of the responsibilities the president gave me and the authority he gave me was like he did in the Recovery Act, is that he instructed the cabinet that do what Joe tells you. You think I'm kidding, I'm not. And the only thing I've learned is how to break down bureaucratic barriers. I'm pretty good at that. But the reason I say that, all kidding aside, is that this executive order the president signed is all hands on deck. Every member of the cabinet has a responsibility. They meet now twice a week. They designate someone to meet with me once every 2 weeks. And we've set benchmarks as to the kinds of things they have to do, because In order for me to ask all of you to help break down barriers, I've got to make sure whatever barriers exist at a federal level that get in the way are cleared. And by the way, I mean what I say. No one's ever doubts I mean what I say. The problem is sometimes I say all that I mean. So look, the question is, we're going to make sure the information is being shared so an oncologist in Fayetteville can access information for a world-class institution like Duke. All this is going to take supercomputing, data analytics, machine learning to spot trends and that no human could see, cloud computing and other technologies to enable data sharing and storage, and more data scientists inspired to use their talents in this field. As one top cancer researcher told me, we have to allow data to actually yield the answers. And that, he argued, was fully within our power if we can figure out how to get some things out of the way. Fourth, it seems to me we need to increase access to clinical trials. Right now, less than 5% of all cancer patients in the United States end up in a clinical trial, and most aren't even given access to their own data. What can we do, and this is a question I will hope you will all talk to, is what can we do to reduce the cost of clinical trials? How do we expand access? Other questions we need to ask is, how do we get drug companies to be part of the solution? And they do great work. This is not a knock on, I'm not an attack on drug companies, but the truth is there are some real impediments. How do we get them to get more engaged in this? Should a person own their own genome and their data? I'm convinced together we can find a lot of answers to these questions, and in the process, I think we can end up developing game-changing treatments and delivering them to everyone who needs them. And that's the goal that I have in mind, the responsibility the President's given me. To double the rate of progress we're making in understanding and treatment of cancer, to make a decade's worth of advances in the next 5 years, and to eventually end cancer as we know it. Now, we're not looking at incremental change. What we're trying to do is end up with a quantum leap on the path to a cure. Last week, the President and I held the inaugural meeting of the first of its kind federal task force for this Moonshot. We met with leaders of every federal agency that had a part to play: NIH, NCI, HHS, Department of Defense, the VA, the Department of Energy, and others. And the data's not even being shared on our watch completely. And it takes a lot of things. As I said, part of it's money. And we've talked about how to increase federal investments, which we did last year. And it's my objective, and it's a bipartisan effort. A number of my Republican colleagues, like we used to work together. This is one area everybody's ready to, I'm not being facetious. It's important to work on. Last year, we moved to increase the National Institute of Health's budget by $2 billion. Of that $2 billion, 195 went directly to the National Cancer Institute, and we're asking for another $800 million in new federal funding for cancer research. 680 of that will go to National Institute of Health. The rest will be spread across government agencies that are working on cancer, and others are. And we talked about coordinating the private and academic sectors to share data and research to make this more collaborative. At this point, where you view the government as being a bureaucratic stumbling block, as I said, and I want to hear from you if you want to talk about that, I promise you, I will clear it away. I promise you. We don't think the federal government is the only answer. That's the most important point I want to make. Barack, the President and I do not see this as a federal decision from on high. This is a question of how can we be helpful? Obviously, we can be helpful in funding. Obviously, we can be helpful in a lot of things we're doing. But what can we do to work with the community to make more progress? The point is, where you view the government as being a bureaucratic stumbling block, I want to make sure that stumbling block is eliminated. And I don't think, as I said, I want to make it clear, this is not a top-down judgment. There used to be, I was a senator for a long time, and I went home got elected 7 times to the United States Senate. I'd go home and hold town meetings on a regular basis. I come from a small state and they expect that. And I was happy to do it. And if you ever want to get a laugh from a town meeting, you'd start off by saying, I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help you. That was always a good way to start off the meeting. But really and truly, I'm from the federal government. We need advice on how we can be more helpful. And we will not hesitate to tell you where we think the community could be more helpful. I'll conclude by saying, Doctor, while I'm going to focus on this the rest of my time in office, I plan on making this a major component of what I'm going to do the rest of my life. And it's something everyone can be part of. Researchers, corporations, oncologists, joining an effort to help us find a way to share data and collaborate. Sign up for clinical trials. Clinicaltrials.gov has a list. Tell your story. Those of you who have been through it, tell your story. Everyone can advocate with their political leaders for the importance of funding and for supporting cutting-edge research. So I really do look forward to our discussion. And again, I'm sorry we got started a little late, but it truly, Mr. President, is an honor to be here at this great institution. And I wish I could say I planned on wearing my Duke colors. I just happened to put it on and realized I made the right pick. I support Duke in everything except when they play Syracuse. Thank you very much. So Doc, maybe you can.
Mr. Vice President, first of all, I want to thank you for your inspiring remarks, and frankly, they're downright exciting. It is an inflection point in this disease, and with your help, I'm sure we can get to that point of doubling our progress or even more. I think the title of the Moonshot is also an excellent title because it captures that strength and that feeling of innovation, just like the original Moonshot, and it's certainly our #1 strategic priority at Duke. I also like the idea because it incorporates the idea that everyone can get involved. The federal government, the physicians, but patients and families everywhere can get involved. And that speaks to some of the disparities that already exist in cancer care. During your remarks, you touched on a couple of key points, I think. Big data and the need to share it. Collaboration and the idea that we should work better together. And that one method of doing that is to break down silos. And I think one way that we can do that is to perform more of this care in a multidisciplinary way. And I hope that here, that within our Brain Tumor Center, where we draw expertise from people at different levels of their training and different departments, to the Duke Cancer Institute, where we've developed an infrastructure that really cuts across those barriers very effectively by a whole new type of organizational structure, to the university here, where we have our whole campus located in one place, so I can walk across the road and talk to engineers, to the community at large, where we work in close connection with UNC, NC State, Durham County, and other organizations. So I'd like to start the discussion maybe by asking for some comments on that approach of multidisciplinary care. And I know that Dr. Wang has been working at looking at some new ways to better understand even existing treatments for cancer, and how do we incorporate multidisciplinary care in trying to better understand the best ways to even use therapies that we have now that are maybe underutilized.
Doctor, you do great work.
Thank you very much. You do as well, Mr. Vice President.
If you want to talk about foreign policy, really don't.
I can't speak to that, but I can say a few words about what we're doing with multidisciplinary care at Duke. And I'm joined here by Dr. Kim Blackwell, who's really my partner in crime. And I think we do a fantastic job of trying to coordinate all the different disciplines that need to come together to treat a patient with cancer. You talked a little bit about how hard it is to get different silos to communicate, and I think we've started breaking down some of those silos in the clinical care realm. It used to be that surgeons like myself wouldn't even talk to the medical oncologist, wouldn't talk to the radiation oncologist. We certainly wouldn't talk to the basic scientists. And as a surgeon now at Duke, in this day and age, I think it's really key that we work collaboratively, not only among the different clinical disciplines, but with the basic scientists as well. I'd like to address a point that you made about big data. One of the things, exciting initiatives we have in our group is that we recognize that it's really difficult to get meaningful data out of the big electronic warehouses that we all have in our institutions. Our initiative in the breast group is to try to organize data at the point of care so that when we enter patient data, as we all need to do when we write our notes, we structure the data so that we don't get garbage in, garbage out. We put in clean data, we put in structured data so that when it comes time to try to pull that data back out of the system, we can do it in a very reliable and structured way. I think the federal government may have a potential role in this, just as it recommended that all healthcare providers consider transitioning to an EMR system. I think that's been done very successfully, but I think the next and very important step is to try to get the data into the system in a way that it can be shared and that it will be meaningfully shared among all the different users of the data. I think physicians such as myself and Dr. Blackwell, others in the group, would be very important in trying to define how those data elements should look. I think other stakeholders on the panel as well as in the audience can also speak to the important data elements that patients and caretakers might want to see in that data as well. So I think that is a role that the federal government can take, and I think a lot of us would welcome leadership in that realm. There are many different data dictionaries, and I think there definitely is an opportunity to try to harmonize them across all different institutions.
Well, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
I found when Dr. Agus talked about standardization, Dr. Collins is the head of NIH and very knowledgeable in the human genome, was a major part of that effort. And Agus at USC talked about there is a standard as it relates to the genome. How difficult, or how necessary and or how difficult would it be to come up with a standardized, essentially, vocabulary, for lack of a better phrase, as to how to record the data? Should there be a national medical board to come up with standardization of the language? Should we look to the oracles and the major tech companies to try to help on that, or is it necessary?
I think it's absolutely necessary. I think it's important for us to all talk the same language, and just as we say, when we're talking about a broken leg or a fracture, it means the same thing, and we need to be able to define it in a way that when we pull the data out, it is recognized as the same thing. The NCI had some big initiatives around this, and particularly around cancer about 10 years ago. And I think although that was a really important effort, I think that the limitation of that was that it really didn't gain traction around the users that could really give it life. And so it sort of died an untimely death in the NCI. And I think if there had been more effort, potentially more funding to gain traction from those institutions, those users who would be responsible for entering the data, I think that could have been a much more successful venture.
Well, I'm interested to hear you say that. As I understand, and I don't know, the history of the last effort was it met with resistance in addition to...
You're talking about CA Big.
Yeah, the funding. Can I ask you another question, Doctor, because you've done so much work in this area. What are some of the most promising areas for cancer diagnosis and detection? Because you guys here are ahead of the curve on a number of things, including other cancers that we haven't spoken about. And the same, I think, at the University of North Carolina. I may be mistaken, but I think that's true. Tell me what are there promising areas that are potential breakthrough technologies to be able to deal with diagnosis and detection?
So I'll take a shot at this, and there are lots of others who I'm sure can chime in as well. I think the limitation currently is not our technology. I think our wisdom in knowing what we're picking up at ever earlier phases is what's really lagged behind the technology. So technology tends to be very black and white. You see it there or you don't. the wisdom of knowing how to translate that into action that will benefit the patient, I think that's the part where we need to work more. So it's not about diagnosing a cancer, it's about diagnosing a cancer that we know can potentially be fatal, and applying precision medicine to those cancers that are likely to be fatal and not overtreating those ones that are likely to never cause a patient harm. I think as we've become smarter about which cancers are likely to be associated with a poor outcome, and many in this room have contributed to furthering the field on that, I think our ability to know what it is that we need to do to address those cancers that are being detected is where we need to do the most work. I think technology is far ahead of our ability to know what to do with the ever earlier cancers, ever more refined and precise diagnoses that we're making. And we're making strides with that, but there's obviously a lot more work that needs to be done.
Kim, how do you, excuse me, we know one another, I apologize. Doctor, how do we,
You can call me Kim.
call me Joe.
Okay.
How do we reach broader patient populations with clinical trials?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's one that I think all of us sitting around this table think about every day. And, on behalf of the patients who would willingly and gladly participate in the trials, I do want to point out that they want to be part of this moonshot. They are in line. They are ready to break down those barriers. They are ready to participate in the clinical trials. Yeah. And I think data sharing has something to do with it, just like you're talking to researchers who are doing their own silo of genetic testing for their own institution. Pharma does the same thing. We have 4 different drugs targeting the same protein, billions of dollars each company for 4 different drugs doing the same thing. And then across disease types, we get one therapy approved for GBM. I'll use that example. We know it's safe, we know it's effective, we know its target, we know the patients that will probably benefit from it. But then we ask pharma to reinvent the wheel and start from ground zero to test it in breast cancer or lung cancer. And immunotherapy has really brought this to the forefront. We live in a country where I don't think there should be 30 cancer patients waiting in line to get in a clinical trial. And this is where collaboration comes into play. It's not just the doctors working together. It's the doctors and the federal government kind of pushing so that pharma makes these drugs available. It's the FDA. They've made some progress with the breakthrough drug designation, which has been great for the companies that have great drugs to raise money.
Push more.
But where we need the breakthrough now is getting those drugs to patients, not just getting them to the FDA, but getting them to the patients that really need them. So thank you, and this is something that I think you can fix.
Well, I'm sorry, did you guys want to comment?
May I jump in?
You
So
sure
I'm a
can.
Tar Heel.
I know that. I know that.
But I'm one of the few in this room.
You have the look of determination.
We have a lot of determination, we Tar Heels. I don't come to this side of town very often, but when I do, it's for the vice president.
I was going to say, this is kind of like, I deserve a Nobel Prize for you bringing Duke and North Carolina together here. I don't know, but...
Well, in all seriousness, we do collaborate, actually a lot, between UNC and Duke, and we're very fortunate to be in such close proximity. I want to add to your list of important investigators, public health scientists and population scientists.
Yep.
I think that the question that you're asking about getting drugs to the right people, there's a step before that, and that is early detection, early diagnosis, and making sure that we don't continue to observe the disparities that we've observed for decades. We have lots of great evidence about not only treatments, but also detection strategies that work. And frankly, they're being underutilized, and they're being underutilized by the poorest people, the minority populations, the rural populations in our country.
Well, the work you did, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it. I won't interrupt you.
No, I thought the work you did looking at minority populations and the response that what was available and what was unknown is really really important. I mean, one of the things I'm finding, Doctor, is that I used to have a friend who was a great basketball player, and when Providence College had those wonderful teams with Walker and Reardon, all pros and the pros, and play with them, and he used to say, you got to know how to know. You've got to know how to know. And it's an interesting phrase. I can take you to the Library of Congress. If you don't know how to use the computer or the catalog, it doesn't matter much to you. But I mean it sincerely. And getting this information, which you try to do all the time, Gail, out to the populations that in fact can use it, is really, it's really, everyone views, I can tell you, as a public official who's in constant contact my whole life with the public at large, it's like they're intimidated by the notion that there's anything within their power they can do other than not smoke, as much as they know, to deal with these disparity-focused research that you've been doing. Anyway, I interrupted you by complimenting you. I apologize.
No, thank you. I happily accept a compliment from the Vice President.
But how do we increase this, improve the pace of progress in connecting research and treatment?
So, well, I can tell you about one initiative that we're doing at UNC that I think is really phenomenal. We've built a data system, the Integrated Cancer Information Surveillance System, that has leveraged largely administrative data and linked them together. So the cancer registry for the state, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance claims data across the state, and we've married that with contextual level data, geospatial information about health services utilization and types of providers that are available. And we've used that information to identify places in the state where we see discrepancies and where we see places where we can improve outcomes. And we're now launching interventions to start to do that in a meaningful way. So as an example, I've been involved in colon cancer screening for a number of years, and you may be aware of the hot spotting analysis that came out, right? And one of the regions that was identified in this hot spotting analysis was in eastern North Carolina. And we've done some additional geospatial analyses to really look at that area, look at the issues of poverty and access to care there. And we're going to be launching interventions there to not only approach it from a systems level, so thinking about, where are the endoscopy centers, where are the types of providers that can provide screening services, but also thinking about it more holistically from a system science perspective. What are the social determinants of outcomes?
Well, I had a great meeting. He's a wonderful guy with the former governor of Utah, whose family has one of the great efforts going on cancer and philanthropy. And the governor wanted to talk to me, came to see me, and wanted to point out the disparities. He was making the point that in the West, there are entire swaths of geography, mainly Native American areas, that have no access. I don't know if you've ever spoken to them, but I might suggest that, I'll give you a number. But all kidding aside, he very much wants me, through this initiative, to try to focus on access.
Right, we have to.
And the response, by the way, folks, is thousands of people have contacted us. Thousands of people have contacted me and through the website, and they may not know much about cancer, but they have a cell phone, they have a phone, they have a device, and it's very plaintive, the request. But I wish I had all day to talk to you about this. But with your permission, we're going to call you again to follow up. Okay?
I would love to do that. Thank you.
If you don't mind, a couple comments I would have too about getting people on clinical trials. As a clinical trialist myself, in our organization, which is an NCI National Cooperative or National Clinical Oncology Program, the NCORE system, we have 256 oncologists in our group. But yet that probably represents only 10% of the oncologists. So why, obviously, do other oncologists not want to join? It's a big issue. And although we heard that there are 30 people waiting to go on a clinical trial, the government, in my opinion, has not adequately educated the American population about the value of clinical trials, and they still consider it being a guinea pig. And that has to change.
Consider what, I'm sorry?
Consider it, for many of them, they consider it being a guinea pig.
Yes.
Okay, and
Yes.
that kind of thought process
Yes.
has to change, but that's going to have to come at a national level and not necessarily at a local level. But getting patients on
Well,
clinical.
let me ask you a question about that. Hold the thought. That is one of the things that I have set as a benchmark for us to begin to do relatively soon, but here's the issue. Assuming you get them to move from viewing this as being guinea pigs to wanting to be part of it, what's the access?
Right.
You know, so
And
I
the
don't want to
access-
open a floodgate and then there's no place to go.
Right. And access is critical, and that's going to require that the NCI and the NIH have a mindset change. Right now, in order to do clinical trials, it goes through a whole bunch of systems. What we need to have, we have a central IRB, that's great. Now what we need to do is we need to have clinical trials that are available to any oncologist who is a clinical trialist, who is credentialed by the NCI or by whomever you choose to credential them, who has access to all the clinical trials. You do it in a just-in-time system. I mean, if you want something from Amazon, you give an extra $15 and you have it at your front door the next morning. So what we should do is have somebody come into my office today with a malignant tumor for which I do not have a clinical trial open, but there is one at government.com. I go ahead and access it. I call somebody, I download the forms off the internet, I have them downloaded, I fill out my 1572, I sign it, I fax it in, the drugs are shipped, and if it's a pharma trial, then fine. Pharma puts one of their little people in the little airplane, they come by my office the next day, they do a site initiation visit, we got the study open. So it doesn't have to be as complicated as it is. And the other issue which interferes with patient access is the audit system for clinical trials. Now, audits are important to prevent fraud. Doctors can commit fraud, plumbers can commit fraud, anybody can commit fraud, and we have to make sure that fraud never occurs. We've seen it happen in South Africa with the bone marrow transplant program. We saw it in Canada with the NSABP trial. So fraud has to be prevented. But what we need is more of a system like what the government does with pilots. I'm a pilot. So I know that if I'm up in the air and I make a mistake, when I land, I fill out a NAFSA form, I fax it in, and then if the FAA comes after me, I've already faxed it in, and I get out a jail-free card. What we need to do prior to audits, they're supposed to be educational, they're not, and FDA audits are definitely not educational, as you heard. What we need to do is prior to an audit, you do your own self-audit, you review your own charts, you find your own problems, you make a corrective action plan, you submit the corrective action plan to the audit committee. When the audit committee comes, they look at it, they see if there are any other mistakes that you made, and you don't get dinged for the audit for the mistakes that you already found. This thought process has trouble moving upstream, but that's how we need to do this.
Well, this
right
is-
now,
this is very-
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, right now, when we get ready for an audit, we try to find whatever the mistakes are, and then we hope that when they do the audit, they don't find them. That is not the way it should be.
One of the things I'd like to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you if you'd be willing tomorrow to get on the phone with one of the docs in my operation and lay out in some detail for me what are, just what you said here, but go into in detail with me again, and I'll get the FDA engaged. I'll get you an answer and see what, I mean, it will just be helpful to me to be as specific as you've been. It'd be
Okay,
helpful.
I'll be glad to.
Okay, good.
Gail, I was going to ask if you and perhaps Howard could address the issues of disparities in care and research and access, even in the Durham community, for example.
While our cancer rates are lower in Durham than in North Carolina, they're still too high. And when you look at people of color, as with any other chronic illness, we fare worse. And most of the times, our illnesses are detected far too far into the progression of the disease. And Jim was saying we need to educate people about clinical trials. And sure, the government needs to do it, but in many communities, it needs to come from people with whom people trust, or have a trust factor. Because in the African-American community, people still go back to Tuskegee. And there is a lack of trust. And there's so many conditions that can be treated effectively, and people can have long lives, high quality life. But because of this fear of cancer, and not knowing all the great advances that have been made, people delay entering into the system. So I think it becomes very important that employers in our community begin to talk to people about healthcare cost, quality of life, and make available those tests, because many people can't afford to get those screenings. And then knowing that there is a long road ahead in terms of being treated and the impact of not being able to work, that is
No, it
huge
is.
decision-making for people.
We tried to deal with part of that in
Yeah.
the ACA,
Yeah.
prevention, but
Yes, yeah, and we
a
do,
lot more has to be done.
appreciate having.
no, I didn't mean it
affordable
for that
care.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just the beginning.
Yeah, it's the very beginning. And as Jim was talking, I was thinking about a personal experience. My aunt was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 85. 2 months later, her son was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. But his wife was a professor. Well, my aunt chose not to do anything because, she had had a long life. And she would just go through the motions of the end-of-life issues. But my cousin, his wife was a professor at Johns Hopkins. He immediately went he got the best pancreatic cancer surgeon. He got treatment, vaccine therapy. And when Johns Hopkins said, we've done everything, then he had to look for other places. And he called me, he says, there's immunotherapy at Georgetown, but I'm number 100. Pray that I get moved up. And then it's like, what does that mean for the 100 who are waiting? And then they exhausted lots of financial resources.
I understand.
He ended up going the last 2 weeks of his life to Cancer Treatment Centers of America in Georgia. Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, Cancer Treatment Centers of America. Trying to make sure he got everything and did everything. And that wreaks havoc on a budget. And they had the skills to navigate that process themselves. It's not
Well,
easy.
No,
Yeah.
it's not easy, and I'm not a physician, but there are certain cancers that are reach the stage that
Yes.
you try everything in the world, but there's certain diagnoses are a death sentence.
Yes.
Based on percentages, and it's difficult, but as my dear mother used to say, where there's life, there's hope, and that's what you keep doing, and I'm sure that anyone would use whatever resources they had if there's any hope for someone they love, but that's sort of, in my view, a slightly different element here, but at any rate, go ahead, Doc.
Brenda, I wondered if you wanted to comment on the role of nursing in oncology, something that we haven't touched on yet today.
Thank you. And
I can write a book on that.
You seem to like nurses.
Oh, I'm serious.
I'll co-edit with you on
It
them
is
too.
the single, I'm telling you, you great researchers are going to find someday, what I think there's some evidence of already, that there is a correlation between the ability of the immune system to fight and attitude of the patient. And there's an overwhelming relationship that I think you all really underestimate
Yes.
between the nurse, male or female. So I don't want to make that sound sexist. I once said, doctors let you live, nurses make you want to live. They thought I was referring to, it's across the board. And I can tell you on behalf of my family and hundreds of families I personally know, what an overwhelming debt of gratitude we owe nurses. I mean, it is not able to be calculated in my view. But anyways.
Well, I thank you on behalf of our more than 39,000 members of our association.
And the fact they've always endorsed me has nothing to do with it. That's for the record. Full disclosure.
On many of the points that have been made, though, nursing is very integral. So, for instance, when we talk about screening and early detection, after as we all recall, the many headlines and TV news stories about what are the mammography screening guidelines, our clinical line lit up. Nurses saying, what are we supposed to tell patients? So when you look at breaking down silos and you look at making things more collaborative, maybe we can get some of these kinds of things worked out as well, that sometimes the messaging that comes from multiple organizations, though well-attended, you would think would be saying the same thing if they're looking at the same evidence, because they all claim to be looking at the evidence. But that's what happens. Things happen in the headlines, and the nurses on the front line are oftentimes the first ones that patients will reach out to, because they're their neighbors. It's not even necessarily the oncology nurses. We know of the 3 million nurses in this country. Many of them will either experience personally, as you noted, or will be caring for people with cancer, but they aren't oncology nursing specialists. Much like the discussion on the big data and trying to standardize nomenclature would definitely be an advance when you listen to nurses talk among themselves about the electronic health records and what they do and they don't capture about the patient experience. They may be capturing well the clinical data, but they may not be capturing well the patient experience and documenting that, and may not have the common language. So how can we improve that initiative among the various corporations that are providing these electronic health records? And we've had some communication with those companies in the past to help them understand about some of the language and some of the information that would be very important to have in there.
Well, let me raise something along those lines. And again, this is anecdotal, and so I can't draw any broad conclusion from it. But for reasons that were both geographic and had to do with responsibilities, employment responsibilities, I observed that there was a difference in 4 major cancer hospitals that I've been involved with in treatment of a family member. And I found there was a correlation between the oncologist and the oncology nurses as to the degree to which the health records reflected the patient's reactions and the patient's response. And I found it interesting that with nurses with a similar degree and similar specializations, depending on the institution, there was a greater or lesser willingness on the part of the nurse to communicate information that they knew, because it was pretty clear that their superiors were either encouraged them to do it or discouraged them from doing it. And one of the things that we all know, and there's not a doctor I know who gets seriously ill who doesn't look for an advocate beyond themselves within the system. And how do we empower patients with the knowledge and the tools to take an active role in their treatment and care?
I think one of the things that the nurses that are at the patient side, whether that's inpatient or outpatient, are very astute at is being the translators of highly technical information. You are correct that depending on institutional culture, how that kind of communication may happen can vary. I think you may, or certainly people in this audience are aware of the initiative of magnet organizations. These are hospital-based organizations, which certainly in those kinds of organizations, you would probably see that the nurses probably are much more integrated into the team, more able to advance that patient-centered environment, with patients being part of the decision-making process, not being absent from that conversation, being part of that, and that nursing very much
I
facilitates
found in
that.
some circumstances, and I imagine the doctors have this experience as well, I found in some circumstances where the head oncology nurse was able to make judgments on the spot
Yes.
that were, quite frankly, equally or in some cases superior to the judgment made by the oncologist who was the resident that night or the oncologist who may have been treating. Now, that's not a criticism of the oncologist. It's more a familiarity
Yes.
with the patient
Yes.
and understanding that what's on the chart is only part of, and that's when you talked about, patient's reactions, patient's response.
Right.
Don't do that with him because he cannot tolerate that particular action requiring swallowing this. Don't do that because, and it makes a world of difference.
And nurses, many nurses will tell you that not only is their work based on science and knowledge and all, but on gut.
Yeah.
And they experience nurse, the intuition in any patient situation becomes another critical factor. And that's the time that you've had to spend with the individual, with their family, to really be able to advocate that way.
I spent 7 months in the hospital,
Yes, you did.
two craniotomies. I've got the clip and a major embolism, and I had great neurosurgeons, two of the best in the world, for real. And and I used to love my nurses, though. They come into the ICU, and as a patient, you sit there and you watch the machines, and when that flatlines, it's a problem. No, I'm serious. Your oxygen level, unless you're an idiot, you understand it all. And you lie there, and what you doctors know, and nurses know even better, sometimes you're just tired. You're not in pain, you just want to say, I don't care, you just want to. And the nurses, in this case was at Walter Reed years ago, the nurses were incredible and doing things that I'm sure they didn't learn in nursing school. I'm not being facetious. I had a woman named, her last name is Nelson, an incredible nurse. And a couple times when I was let's just go, I'm happy, you're really happy to say goodbye, and she breathed in my nostrils. The tactile thing was the thing that, and I asked my doc, I said, my nurse says, where did you learn that? I said, she did what? Or they'd say, that pillow's really uncomfortable. I'll bring you one from home. For
Yes.
real.
And it can make all the difference.
No, it's amazing. Anyway, I don't want to get off on nurses here too much, but I do think this thing about what you're talking about is how do you, in terms of the record keeping, electronic health records, what is relevant beyond what the chart, what the data shows? And
Yes.
is it important to be part of the record?
It's not, we have to, what I've seen in my 40-plus years in nursing, and the very first cancer research unit at Duke, when the Comprehensive Cancer Center opened, and we had clinical trials, phase 1 and phase 2 here back in the 70s. And where we are today is phenomenal. It is absolutely, but we can never forget there's a person. It's not all about the cellular level, the drug, the immunotherapy agent.
Sorry to take so much of your time, but this is of great interest.
Well, I think that is something that we should maybe touch upon and maybe explore a little bit more as the patient's perspective. And I think, Susan, sometimes, very frequently, the foundations represent the patients and their interests. And then, Nicholas, you have obviously a very personal experience with this that I'm sure the Vice President would share and be interested in hearing both of your comments from that perspective.
Two things from the patient side. One is the active involvement in research, the interest in the clinical trials on behalf of the patient as well as their families, but also for those who aren't yet patients. We advocate for those as well, which goes to the public health issues, that side, and many families who have unfortunately lost someone to cancer will often tell us that they are hopeful that the research will continue on behalf of others so that they won't have to go through what their family member did. So we look to that side of patient advocacy as well, the patient or the person that we hope will never be a patient. But from a pragmatic point of view, I think that involving patients in the design of clinical trials and in the review of those trials and studies to be a part of all of the processes helps a great deal in all of us understanding better what it is that that human component is and will be taken on when a study is done, when research is being done. And for us, I mean, because we raise a lot of money and spend a lot of money on cancer research, just the fact of getting people engaged in raising money for research, because then they start to do their homework and they say, oh, this is important and we believe in it. So it's also got an educational piece to it as well. So that's a part of what we do in terms of outreach, as well as the direct working with people who are going through a cancer journey.
Well, you're nurturing a lot of young talent too, to get engaged.
We really do. We love to work with the young investigators and keep them engaged in that humanistic walk through being a researcher and staying engaged. That's real important in what we fund. And when you talk about multiple disciplines, we fund some convergence grants, which are bringing together investigators from different institutions as well as different disciplines. So chemistry and engineering and data sciences, and then in different institutions working on a common problem in oncology, and funding the young people to both learn how that works, to bring the convergence together, as well as to be a part of the project itself, has been, we think, interesting, and engaging patients in that so they recognize that multidisciplinary research need. So not just in the care, which is critically important, but in the performance of the research as well.
Well, thank you, Susan.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here. My experience, my family's experience, touches on every single one of the issues that have been brought up, except one, which is AYA care, adolescent and young adults. So my daughter Sophie was in 9th grade 3 years ago when she was diagnosed with cancer. She was at UNC. She got the best possible care. The doctors there did exactly what you asked them to do. They broke down the silos. They sent her samples across the country and around the world. But it just wasn't enough. And 10 months later, she died. She noticed some things that she wanted us to address. And that was the gap in care for this adolescent age group. And you're nodding your head, the nurses notice this very well. When you're 15, you're not a 5-year-old. And the pink elephants and the purple balloons, which are wonderful for the little kids, are annoying for 15-year-old. Because this is the time when you're trying to discover your identity and independence. When you turn 18, as you all know, you can move to the adult side. But as annoying as a children's hospital is, the adult side for young adults are incredibly depressing. So virtually every single patient and Sophie's doctor sent over to the adult side, they come back. They'd rather be in the children's hospital. Being a teenager is incredibly hard. We all remember this time. You're struggling with your identity, trying to maintain your dignity, trying to find out who you are, and all that is stripped away from you. And you just become a patient in a hospital. Now, luckily, Sophie had it somewhat easier because we're from Chapel Hill. I teach at UNC. We had so many resources available to her. It's just one example. She loved playing field hockey. So on her birthday, a student of mine's roommate was on the field hockey team. So she was able to bring the UNC field hockey team to her Sophie's room with a home and away jersey with her name on it. Nice. It was unbelievable. It meant the world to Sophie. But Sophie realized that was unusual because the kids there from Roanoke Rapids don't have that. They might not have the gas money to drive up very often. Their parents can't get off work. So there's great, great isolation. And she wanted us to do something about that. So after she died, my wife and I, Lucy, who of course is in the audience somewhere, who I'd really like you to meet, we started the Be Loud Sophie Foundation. And we are funding now an adolescent and young adult program director at UNC, which I think is the first in the country to look specifically at this age population, because they're not children anymore, but they're not adults either. So she's meeting with patients one-on-one, and what she's so good at is she's not treating them as patients, but she's treating them as Sophie, the 15-year-old field hockey player who's not Michael, the 18-year-old football player. She's building staff awareness. A lot of this is just simply the staff. It doesn't require big, expensive training programs, just making the staff aware to treat these patients a little bit different from the 10-year-olds. She's crucially bridging the children's hospital and the adult hospital, because her primary doctor, Ian Davis, when we first talked about this, we thought we're going to deal with 13 to 18-year-olds. And he said, don't forget about the young adults. He sees Fort Bragg soldiers, 22-year-olds, all the time, and they are just as isolated because their families are back in Texas. So now we're working from 13 to 26-year-olds. That's the age group. And the final thing that she's very involved with, of course, with the doctors, is starting to explore a research agenda. How do you help these patients? Because they are different. The disparity and the access resonates with us so much. They don't participate in clinical trials for reasons that you all know much better than I do, but from what I can tell, it's partly just the logistics of it. It's just hard to get them involved. And then once they're involved, it's hard to keep them in a clinical trial. And the last thing I just want to say is, again, I so much echo your call for sharing data, because luckily, any given hospital does not have that many adolescent and young adult cancer patients. But all the more reason this data needs to be shared so we can build a robust research agenda to address the unique psychosocial and medical needs of these patients.
Well, I'm sorry, very sorry about your daughter. You speak for thousands of parents. I've done an awful lot of work with children's hospitals, and I know, let me explain what I mean by that, whether it's DuPont Children's Hospital, not cancer-focused, or CHOP in Philly, or the massive new investment they just made in oncology, children, and it's interesting. It's the only thing I've become aware of is the point you're making about there is no automatic cutoff line here. It's not all balloons and clowns coming in and, Make-A-Wish Foundation, although that's critically important. And my sense is, and I hope I'm right about this, is at least in the major metropolitan areas, there's a growing awareness, and the major cancer institutions are growing awareness of this, this need to respond to the, lack of a better phrase, the psychological gap that exists there. And but let me just say to you and your wife, I think what you're doing is wonderful. We all have had our experiences with everyone in this room, with death and tragedy, and when you've been through it, as many of you have a different perspective. And although right after I got elected, my wife and daughter were killed in an automobile accident, my broadsided by a tractor trailer, and my two sons were badly injured and hospitalized for a long time. And then the loss of my son, I got a letter, and it may be of value to some of the people listening. A wonderful, wonderful woman, a great friend is Vicki Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's wife. It's not a political statement. It's just they have hearts as big as their heads. And she sent me a very lovely letter regarding my beau, my son, the Attorney General. And it was very touching. And when she included a letter, she said, and Teddy was one of my, not so much ideological, but personal mentors, because when the accident happened, he's one of the people who convinced me to stay, along with some other people, including two of my Republican colleagues in the Senate. And she said, when he'd get down, he'd take out of his top bureau drawer a letter that Ambassador Kennedy had written to a very close friend of his father, Ambassador Kennedy, to a very close friend who had lost his son. I think the letter was 1956, don't hold me to that. And I asked Vicky's permission whether I could share this in other fora. And this man, his friend, I'm making the name up, John, lost his son, as we beloved. And Ambassador Kennedy, writing to him, said, who had just lost earlier in World War II his son Joe, over the English Channel. And he said, John, he said, I can't tell you how to deal with the pain. I don't know of any solution to that except one. He said, I decided that the most important thing I could do with the rest of my life is work on those things that made Joe move, made Joe alive. And he said, I find overwhelming solace in doing that. So it's obvious you're getting great solace from following Sophie's request to you. And it's unsolicited, but I found that you have some positive advice for parents going through some difficult times. My heart goes out to you.
It's very moving, the support we've gotten from this community. It's unbelievable. If I may just say one more thing that's so especially tragic is that the outcomes, the medical outcomes of AYA cancer patients have stagnated in 30 years. They've not improved. They've improved for pediatrics and adults. There've been no improvement in the AYA. And I think that's unacceptable. I hope we can work on that.
I'm aware.
I wonder if on that very inspirational note and admonition to all of us to keep fighting this disease, if it wouldn't be a good opportunity for me to thank all the people in the audience, in the Duke, UNC, and broader Durham community for making this an area that would attract such attention, and for your hard work every day. And in particular to the leadership of Dr. Casson and the Duke Cancer Institute, Chancellor Washington here at the Medical Center, and President Broadhead at Duke. And to the federal government as a whole for the work that you've done and you're about to do, to President Obama for his action item to you to get this done, and for you for taking so much of your time out of today to show us how authentically you really care about this disease and the people that are working in this field. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. And by the way, the amount of talent that resides here, and at very bluntly a dozen other great institutions in this country, should give people hope. There really is hope. Who would have said 5 years ago that your colleague would conclude that a polio virus injected into the brain, directly into a tumor, glioblastoma, which, as I said, is usually a death sentence, depending on what stage it's at, and most, that you'd have a magnificent young person back in the saddle working here again. I mean, if you had said that 5 years ago, people would have looked at you like, what are you crazy? And, but it's because of the dedication of all of you docs and nurses. I really mean it. You know, my son-in-law is one of the leading reconstructive surgeons in the Delaware Valley, for real. I'm not just saying it, but he's rated at that, and he does mostly flaps. The cancer patients who lose half their faces and they're arms and their ears and the rest, and he's brilliant at what he does. But what most people don't realize, but you know, you spend half your life and hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get through residency, just get to the place where you'll be able to do what you do. The sacrifices you make are real, and although everyone likes their doc when it's working, and you're the most respected profession, I just think it's important for people to know, particularly those of you who've specialized and spent so many years of your life, just to get to the place where you're able to do what you care about. My dad had an expression, Doc. He said, it's a lucky person who gets up in the morning, puts both feet on the floor, knows what they're about to do, and thinks it still matters. We are lucky, and I mean this sincerely, we're lucky you all think it still matters, because it does. I look forward to working with your team, Mr. President, with your permission, and I am educable, and I need the help. Thank you all so very, very much.